Now, according to the famous and outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins, the God of the Old Testament was a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynist. Well, you get the picture. But then on the other hand, you have the writers of the Old Testament themselves saying that the God of the Old Testament was in fact a gracious and compassionate God who was slow to anger and abounding in love. So which view of the God of the Old Testament is the right one? Now, if your idea of the God of the Old Testament is a result of the reading of only a few isolated passages out of the Old Testament, or worse still, from the likes of someone like Richard Dawkins, then you might be inclined to think that, well, those writers of the Old Testament must have suffered from the Stockholm Syndrome, that they had suffered so much at the hands of the God of the Old Testament that something had snapped psychologically and they were somehow trying to defend their cosmic abuser. Well, here's 3 reasons why that's not the case. It's become quite fashionable to bash Western culture, as though Western culture is the most evil thing to have ever happened to humanity. But when you compare the West with the rest of the world, Western culture isn't so evil after all. And in a similar way, from our vantage point of the 21st century, it's very easy for us to think of the God of the Old Testament as some twisted, psychotic monster. And yet when you compare him with all the other deities of ancient Mesopotamia, well, your perspective of him begins to change. That when compared to all the others, well, he begins to look not so awful after all, that he really was a God of compassion who was slow to anger and abounded in love. Now, I realize for some of you watching this video, you may not believe in the miraculous, and so you see the miracles described by the writers of the Old Testament as stories, myths, legends. Well, okay, fair enough. For argument's sake, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But what you need to understand is that even if they were just stories, they play a central role in understanding the narrative of the Old Testament of God's dealings with his rebellious people. Now, I'm sure that you yourself have said before that, well, if there's a God, then why doesn't he give me a sign, even just a little one, to prove that he's really there? Well, according to the Old Testament writers, God proved himself again and again, parting the Red Sea, rescuing the Israelites from Egypt with 10 plagues, doing all sorts of amazing things, and yet they continuously rebelled against him and didn't do what he asked them to do. Now, I don't know about you, but the God of the Old Testament showed far more patience with the ancient Israelites than I would have, that he truly was a gracious and compassionate God who was slow to anger and abounded in love. Now, in ancient Mesopotamia, a common treaty that kings would make amongst themselves was known as a suzerainty treaty, whereby the most powerful king, the suzerain, would agree to be the protectorate of the less powerful kings, his vassals. And in the treaty was a section of blessings and curses, whereby the suzerain would list off all the ways he would bless his subjects just as long as they obeyed him, but then he would also list off all the nasty things he would do to them if they didn't obey him. Now, if this sounds kind of familiar to the book of Deuteronomy, well, that's because the book of Deuteronomy was structured just like a suzerainty treaty. Yet Israel's divine suzerain king was far more lenient than his earthly counterparts, because no earthly suzerain king would have put up with a non-stop rebellion of the Israelites. Yet the God of the Old Testament, century after century after century, pleaded with his people through the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah to remain faithful to him, to remain faithful to the covenant, to remain faithful to this suzerainty treaty. And for that reason, along with the other 2 that I've just given, in the minds of the Old Testament writers, the God of the Old Testament was a gracious and compassionate God who was slow to anger and abounding in love. Well, it's that time of year again when many of our church youth are heading off to college and university where their faith will be challenged. So for the month of September, I thought I would deal with topics that might be of interest to them. Next week's video, we'll be dealing with how faith isn't some irrational emotional response, but rather something that is very rational. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see you next Thursday.